Hi, I'm excited to see everyone here today. My name is Monique Normand. I'm a social worker here in Northern Nevada in Reno, and I do a lot of different community work. Today, I'm just excited that you all came to join us and have this conversation. I think these small group conversations are really important. And so before we get started, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guests. I'm here with Plan Action today, and Tom Steyer, he's an activist and businessman. He built a successful global business from scratch and since then has pledged to give most of his net worth to charitable causes in his lifetime. He left the private sector 10 years ago and committed his life to fighting climate change and successfully built one of the most effective progressive grassroots organizations in the nation, Next Gen Climate. Please join me in welcoming candidate Tom Steyer. Okay, so I know a lot of folks know you from Next Gen, but can you tell us kind of why you decided to jump in the race and put your hat in and run?
Sure. Well, I guess I'm left now. So I really decided to run really late. I have been in this race for about 2.5 months, since something like July 10th. And the reason I decided to run is I was very worried watching the debates that no one was going to tell the truth about what's really going on. Because what I was hearing were very thoughtful policy discussions about which is the best healthcare plan, which is the best Green New Deal, which is the best education plan. But what I wasn't hearing was anybody talking about how we were going to get any of those plans. Because I've spent 10 years as an outsider in politics, putting together coalitions of citizens. I've done it here in Nevada, I've done it in my home state, of ordinary citizens to take on corporate power and beat the corporations. And every one of those issues, healthcare, Green New Deal, education, there's a reason that the government is failing. I mean, my basic thesis for running is the government is broken, and it's broken for a reason. Corporations have bought it, and they like it to fail. Its failure is their success. And I felt like if all we're going to discuss is the different healthcare plans we can't get and the different Green New Deals we can't pass, that can't be the discussion in America in 2020. All the discussions were important. I have opinions about which one is better, and I'm happy to share them. But the real question is, how are we going to get any of them? And so I thought, I need to run to tell the truth that this is about how do we break the corporate stranglehold on the democracy? How do we deal with climate real time? Because it is an emergency. Because if we can do those two things, all the things that we want, the overwhelming number of Americans want healthcare as a right. The overwhelming number of Americans want an education system from pre-K through college that our children need. We want a living wage, work one job. We want clean air and clean water. The question is, how are we going to get them? And I'm saying, if we can do those two things, we can get them all. And I'm happy to argue about exactly how they should be configured. It's important. But really the question is, can this government start to serve the American people again instead of the corporations? Because if it starts to serve the American people, we are rich enough, we are technologically capable enough to deliver all of those services guaranteed to every American and have that be the floor of existence here. And if we do that, that will be freedom. I always say to people, if your kid is sick and you can't afford to go to the doctor, that is not being free. And so we need to get to a place where that foundation of rights in the 21st century is available to every American, and we can do that. But we've got to understand what's in our way, we've got to name it, and then we've got to overcome it. And that's why I'm running, is to say, let's face our problems. We're not a failed society, we have a failed government. Let's fix the government, fix our problems, and we're going to be in the best shape of any people in the history of this planet.
Well, I think all of that kind of starts with having these small group discussions. So I want to thank you for joining us here today.
This is what I love to do, you guys. Just so you know, I've been doing this full time for 7 years, just traveling around the country and talking to people and asking them what their reality is so I can understand it, so I can be smarter. So that's really what I'm hoping to learn today, is from you guys, what you're seeing, what you care about, so I can be smarter going forward and do a better job of representing you.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and let some of our folks ask a couple questions.
Thank you for being here, Mr. Steyer. And I loved what you said, especially because I'm a healthcare advocate. My name is Vivian Leal, and I have multiple sclerosis. I've had that since 1999. So I've done a lot of work bringing up the challenges that people with chronic illness face in our society. But we're no longer the only ones challenged in our current system. Every family, and we can't talk about the economy without talking about the financial fear that most families have of a member of a child, a spouse, becoming ill and not being able to afford their care and especially their medication. So in light of everything that you said about our broken system, I would love to hear from you about the pharmaceutical industry, because we have had a lot of talk about transparency. We've had a lot of talk about attempting to have small negotiations around the fringes. But the truth is that the more I've had to study this, right, for my own mobility and survival, and that of the people that I advocate for, I realized that we have a legislatively enabled racket that patients are basically being extorted for medications that they need to live. It is not a free market. I don't have a choice if I'm going to take my disease-modifying therapy for MS or not, if I want to keep talking and walking, and neither do diabetics about their insulin. The prices never go down, and every single taxpayer is paying for this, whether they think that they are sick or not, because all of our public programs have to pay for these things. So I would love to hear your thoughts about going backwards and looking at all our laws and our regulations and fixing this system, because right now it really is extortionary and the American people and the American Treasury are hostage.
So that's a pretty good summary. And it really, and it is, and the conclusion that you came to, Vivian, is exactly the conclusion that I was trying to put forward, which is there's a reason this system is broken. The corporations have bought the government. And so the government isn't trying to serve you. They're actually enabling these corporations to make as much money as they possibly can. And there's no way to look at this system without also looking how other countries do it. So for instance, you mentioned insulin. Insulin was invented, I think, in 1930. There are 25 million diabetics in the United States of America. We pay 10 times as much for insulin as people in Canada. It's the same drug. It's not on patent. You know, the way drugs work is they develop a drug and they get about 7 years where they have an exclusive right to sell it. But after that, generic drug makers can make it, and so therefore the price should go down a ton. In the case of insulin, this happened literally 90 years ago. So why would that happen? And then they passed a law that said it's illegal to drive to Canada to buy your insulin. So you know, I mean, we're in a situation where we have to beat these companies. And there are a couple different ways to do it in this case. One is other countries negotiate against these companies. The United States government doesn't. They're in the pockets of the companies. So we literally don't negotiate the way every other country in the world does. So we pay multiples for the exact same drug. And we're not talking about countries that are, you know, much poorer than ours. We're talking about Switzerland and France and Germany and Canada and Japan, rich, rich, rich countries. So that's the first point, is how we actually deal specifically with drug companies, whether that's why I'm in favor of a public option, where you use the buying power of the American government to ruthlessly negotiate the prices down. I mean, I noticed, this is a longer answer than you want, I noticed on January 2nd that the prices of hundreds of drugs got raised in the United States. Did the costs of hundreds of drugs go up on January 2nd somehow magically? Or did the companies just want to make more money and it's the first day of the year, so they figured, let's make a little more loot? So the second thing is, I think that this is going on in every industry. The drug industry is so egregious that everybody gets it. But this is going on, I mean, I was talking about, it's not just healthcare, it's going on, I mean, climate. Why are we not dealing with a climate crisis? Because the companies don't want us to. We have to go after them. I've suggested, first, First of all, using the Federal Election Commission to go after the dark money in politics, the hidden secret money that's used to sway politics illegally, and where the Federal Election Commission is basically moribund. But also I've suggested term limits for people in Congress and the Senate, the ability to have a national referendum, so if something's really wrong and we all know it, but Congress just won't do anything about it, like mandatory background checks on every gun purchase, we can pass the law the way you can in Nevada. Make sure it's easy to vote. One of the things that's going on here is an attempt to prevent people from voting who would be progressive or democratic, specifically African Americans, suppression, but also to make it easy to vote the way people in Nevada have done in 2019. And lastly, to get rid of the idea that corporations are people. The drug companies are definitely not people. And they shouldn't be treated like people in our society. They shouldn't have the political rights of people, because they're not people. There really is a question here across the board of who are these elected officials representing? Is it the corporations and their profits, or is it the people sitting in this room? And the answer is, it's not the people sitting in this room. And that's why people are paying so much for healthcare, not just the drug costs. That's the most egregious and obvious point, because you can compare it so easily to every other country. It's pretty much across the board.
Yeah, and I'm going to pass the mic in a minute, but I just want to put another thought in your head. We've worked so hard to increase the coverage for everyone to some kind of health care, but at the same time, accessing that health care, even for people who are covered, first of all, financially, and what the percentage of anyone's income that you have to pay to keep that coverage, but also in the barriers that the healthcare companies are placing on people, for example, like me, on coverage. They'll cover my drug, but not the infusion, which is the only way I can get the drug in my body.
Yeah.
So I'll pass it on now. Lynette, do you have a question?
Nice to see you.
Nice to you too. I go to Sparks High School, and I think climate change is very important. And if you're president, what is your first action of climate change?
So, Christian and I, just so you guys know, have had a short discussion about this by chance yesterday. So I know he really cares about this issue. What I've said is that I would declare a state of emergency on climate on day one of my presidency, that I would make it priority one, that I would I would ask Congress in the first 100 days to pass some version of the Green New Deal, but I would make it priority one and start acting on it on the first day. There are three things that I would do. Second of all, I'm aware that the way that pollution is centered in the United States is on specific communities, which is low-income communities, black and brown communities. Everything I've ever done on climate, I've tried to start in those communities from a position of environmental justice to make sure that the impacts of the policies are fair, and to make sure that the people from those communities are leading in the policy discussions, and that what they have to say is front and center. And that's, in my mind, absolutely critical for a justice-based climate policy. That's my second point on day one. And the third thing is this. We all know this is a global problem. We know this is a problem that the United States cannot solve by itself. And so this is going to have to be, from day one, the leading point we make about our international foreign policy. We can't solve this by ourselves. Mr. Trump's foreign policy is basically to say we have no friends, we have no allies, we have no coalitions, we have no shared values, we are simply in competition with every other country in the world. They're all, in effect, somewhere between competitors and enemies. With that attitude, we absolutely can never solve the climate crisis. We have to use this as an opportunity to rebuild our relationships and alliances around the world, and to remind ourselves that to solve the problems of the world, it's going to take American leadership as part of a coalition of like-minded countries, some of which we'll disagree with about other things, but this is a problem for us to solve together as a world, or we won't solve it. And so, Christian, I promise, I understand the threat of this, but I also know, and Lonnie and I talked about this, and we can clean up the air and the water at the same time. And that's going to be especially important that we do that, because that's a place where there's de facto discrimination in the United States, where the water, I always say, who lives in Flint, Michigan? Who lives in Newark, New Jersey? Take a look where the water makes people sick. Take a look who has asthma, specific communities. And we have to make sure that solve this broad global problem, that we're also being fair, justice-minded people at home, to make sure that people understand that our hearts are in the right place and our hearts are in the right place.
I'll follow up with that. So we all want to see more new green jobs. Is there a way to have that transition and have those jobs be like good jobs, good, well-paying jobs with health benefits?
So the short answer to that is yes. Let me say this. In the entire time that I've been organizing in politics over the last 10 years, I've tried to make sure from the very first day that I am aligned with organized labor. When I came to Nevada the day before yesterday, before I checked into my hotel, I went to the UAW strike to make sure that I understood what was going on in that, and to make sure they understood that I was on their side. When we think about the jobs that we're going to create, and the plan that I put forward creates over 4.5 million direct jobs every year for at least 10 years. The key is going to be to make sure that they're organized, that they're well paid, that they're distributed fairly throughout the communities, and that we take care of any workers in industries that may decline. So we've also set aside $50 billion to make sure that if you're one of the people, through no fault of your own, whose industry is going to decline, that we're not going to solve this problem on your back. And in fact, the same way that I said, we're going to start day one by going to communities who have been specifically affected by pollution and make sure that their leadership and information is critical in designing the policies. We would do for the communities where people are going to, through no fault of their own, in declining industries, we're going to make sure we go to them and ask them how they want to use that money, and how to actually make sure that they are the first people in line for the new jobs. Because these should be, if you think about what it would take to rebuild America, that's what we're really talking about. Rebuild a sustainable America. That's a lot of good paying jobs. That's a lot of people doing, going into buildings and changing them, redoing the electrical system of the United States of America, building a lot of new stuff. We'd want to make sure that people are taken care of in this. But I think that from an objective standpoint, people understand that this is what I'm saying is true, that this will be a job creator on a massive scale, that they will be good paying jobs. The two things that people talk about are, how do you take care of the people who are in declining industries? You've got to do that up front. You've got to do it up front. And honestly, the promises of government in this have been pretty hollow. And the second thing is, we're going to have to deal with the Republican lies, because they're going to say it's jobs or the environment. Yeah. Whereas in fact, we know from every study we've done, it's jobs and the environment. And that included in this we will create energy at a lower rate than any fossil fuel plant.
Great, thank you. Another question?
Yeah, Don Gallimore Sr. here. I just wanted to mention that a consequence of stagnant wages is that 4 out of 10 people can't afford emergency services, medical bills, $400 or more. And I just wanted to know what you plan on doing about potentially increasing wages. I know that reparations is one of my big topics, and that's mainly because the African Americans had their farms, they got their land, they had their jobs, and it was all taken away again. And I think that this is time to pay them back right now. This is the time that that would heal, that I can see, I almost know, that would heal part of that community, and that would bring us closer to a more peaceful America.
So Don, that's two. Do you mind if I do those questions? That really is two questions. Can I do first the one about earnings and second one about reparations?
Sure.
Okay. So let's talk for 1 second about stagnant wages. I'm saying that the basic point about American government is that corporations own it. And one of the proof points to that, for that to me, is that since 1980, probably 80% of Americans have not had a raise once you take into account healthcare inflation, rent inflation, and the cost of education. And so, how could that possibly have happened where over 2 generations, working people in America have not had a raise? And the answer is because there has been a successful, unrelenting campaign to break the rights of working people in the marketplace. It really started with breaking the air traffic controller strike by Mr. Reagan, and that has been an unrelenting attempt to put in right to work states, take away the ability to negotiate, take away the ability to access the laws of the United States to sue your employer. There has been a very successful, unrelenting campaign, and the result has been twofold. Keep all the money, break the arms and legs of the Democratic Party, which is organized labor. So in order to reverse that, is there one magic bullet? There are a lot of bullets, but none of them is a magic bullet. Am I in favor? The minimum wage hasn't kept up since 1970 or even close. So have I been part of the fight for 15? Sure, I've been part of the fight for 15. But in parts of the United States, $15 an hour is not a living wage. So I know that. Have I pushed against all the laws that have been enacted to try and prevent workers from organizing? Sure. I mean, I always say to people, walk into Walmart and negotiate your salary. Go ahead, see how that works for you. You can't do it. How can a person negotiate against a multinational corporation? It cannot happen. So I think, am I in favor of all of the things we can do to support organized labor so that people can have someone representing them, so that it's a much more of a fair negotiation? Yes, I am. Am I in favor of undoing the laws like right to work laws? Yes, I am. Am I in favor of increasing minimum wage? Yes, I am. When I went to, am I opposed to all the ideas about the gig economy? Yes, I am. I mean, if you look, and I think some people heard me say this last night, what was going on at the UAW was a perfect example of labor relations in the United States. GM was going bust, and the UAW went in and gave gigantic concessions to keep them alive. They wanted their jobs, but they basically came in as partners and took a huge hit in order for that company to be able to survive the recession. 11 years later, the company is making billions, tens of billions of dollars, and they basically are trying to treat full-time employees as temps and pay them half as much. So it's like, are you kidding? These people came in and did you this gigantic favor as partners, and now you're treating them, in a way that's completely, at best, unethical. And that's actually my opinion about that's why I wanted to go to the strike, because this whole thing about the gig economy, you have the freedom to work for nothing, that's not a freedom. Like, one of the things, I don't know if you guys saw this, they did a study of what Uber drivers really get paid, $5.50 an hour. They are, self-employed. It's like, this is just an attempt to get around the laws that were put in to protect workers from rapacious employers. So am I in favor of fighting all those things? Yes, I am. I think what's gone on, if you look the fact that workers haven't had a raise for 40 years, that's crazy. That's so wrong, it's crazy. The tax laws to reduce taxes on the richest people and on corporations, that's crazy. I mean, this is stuff like, this makes no sense in our society. It's not just, it's not democratic, it's not sustainable. This is not going to become a banana republic is not something we should aspire to. It also doesn't work. People don't put up with that over time. So does that answer your question? It's an attitude. You have to have my attitude is, I'm in favor of the workers. They've gotten screwed. You have to push. It's just like the drug companies. You have to push back every day. Every time they do something, you're like, no, I don't care what you think. No. You've got to be relentless in pushing. In terms of reparations, I'm for reparations. Just so you know. Think about this for 1 sec. 400 years of legalized discrimination and unfairness. The deepest injustice. There's never been an apology. It's amazing.
That's why we need reparations.
I know, but I'm just saying. But think about that. So, and one of the things that has inspired me on this is what happened in South Africa. So Nelson Mandela and Bishop Tutu had a program that I thought was brilliantly conceived, which was truth and reconciliation. And I think as part of reparations, just so you know, Don, what's been proposed in Congress, which was proposed by Congressman Conyers for years, was to do a study. And I actually think the truth part of this is really important. People don't know the history. I think many people in the African American community do know the history. But I think there are a lot of other people in America who don't know the history. And I think as part of this, we really should be retelling the story of America. Do people really know what Jim Crow was? I can tell you, I went down to the opening of the memorial to the victims of lynching in Montgomery, Alabama, which was probably about 1.5 years ago. I'm gonna guess it was probably April or May of 18. And so I thought I knew something about Jim Crow, and I definitely learned things. I think as part of reparations, to figure out how best to do this, it's important that we retell the story of America, we retell the story of the contributions and leadership of the African American community in America. We make it, I think, who built America, where has the moral leadership for America come from? Not just from Dr. King, but for hundreds of years and after Dr. King. So when I think about reparations, I think about a deep retelling of this story. Because what I think happens in the way that policy happens is, policy comes out of people's understanding of the world. And there's been a false story about this country for 400 years. The first step is to retell the story truthfully and to make it clear what really happened, so that then we can talk about, okay, now what do we do about that? How do we make up for that? But the idea that you could have 400 years of deliberate, intentional, deep discrimination, and it would make no difference, and you just go on like it never happened, it doesn't make any sense. I know that. And it's time. I know that.
Tom, my name is Chip. I'm a resident here in Reno and one of the activists with Indivisible's chapter up here. You and I are both out of the business community, and I come with the basic sense that businesses respond to laws, policies, most times, and incentives. And I think you're absolutely right. The relationship between the big corporation money and our government is just wrong. It's out of whack. But if you were president, what sort of measures would you take to get business on board for climate change work?
Well, when it comes to climate change, I think there are a lot of businesses who aren't directly involved, where therefore the people running them can see what's happening and aren't in a position of needing to deny it for the sake of their bottom line. And so I think that in that case, they're really acting just like normal American citizens. I think the issue here is the oil and gas companies and the coal companies really have a business model that is directly, they need to burn fossil fuels to make their money. And it's sort of like a cigarette company. They sell cigarettes. And they can define themselves as energy companies, and that's fine with me, but they've been fighting tooth and nail against this. And honestly, if you look at the financial community, they've been financing fossil fuel companies forever, and it's a huge business for them. So look, the way I think about this is the government of the United States is supposed to represent the people of the United States. And they're supposed to pass laws for us. And they're supposed to protect us. And the businesses are supposed to obey them. And, you know, honestly, they should come on board as citizens, but it's going to be very hard for people in those fossil fuel companies, even in their own minds, to be honest. And so I don't want to wait for them. I mean, I'm saying day one, state of emergency, we're going to have new rules. You're going to have to obey them. And I'll tell you 2 stories about how I think about this. Because obviously, look, I came from the private sector. I know that we need the competitiveness and entrepreneurship and, you know, really effectiveness of the private sector. I know that. I think any country that hasn't had that hasn't prospered the way we've prospered. But I'll tell you, I went up to look at the oil sands in Canada because I was against building the Keystone Pipeline, and I thought I should go. I can't just run my mouth. I need to see what it looks like. And I was staying with a First Nations person up there, the tribe, the chief of the local First Nations tribe. And the oil sands were putting all of their chemicals and all their sludge, because it's basically mining stuff and extracting oil from sand. And then they take all the sand with all the chemicals they've put in it, and they put it in the water. And so the people who were living there were getting sick. It was a huge cancer cluster. So I'm living with this guy, and he told me this story. So he's about a 45-year-old construction worker. That's what he looks like. He's wearing, you know, like a down vest and jeans and a flannel shirt. He has half a lawyer. For 20 years, he's been trying to represent his tribe against these companies that are polluting the water and where the people are dying. For 20 years, they lose. And, you know, they have half a lawyer. The oil companies have 40 lawyers. And one lawyer who he's negotiating with, every couple of years, he'll go like, look, I'll tell you what, we'll build you a new gym. Like, they never actually take care of the problem, but they throw him a bone every couple of years. So after 20 years, the head lawyer resigns. He retires on Friday, calls the chief on Monday and says, don't ever stop fighting. You are the only thing between your tribe and extinction. So that guy knew for 20 years exactly what he was doing, but that was his job. And so he took the money, and he felt like, if that's my job, I have to stand up and represent the company, and, you know, we're going to do what we do. But he knew the whole time that actually what he was doing was killing these people. And so did I think he was a bad guy? No. You're talking about incentives. His incentive was to do his job as well as possible. And if that meant literally killing these innocent people, he was going to do it. And so when I think about this, I want the government of the United States to make sure we're representing those people. I mean, this happens to be in Canada, but that's the job of the government of the United States, not to worry about the profits, to make sure that the people are okay. So my opinion about this stuff is going to be, I want the government to make sure, my fight here isn't with the private sector at all. My problem here is the private sector thinks they can write the rules for them to live under. And I have a real problem with that. That's my problem with drug companies. That's my problem with these oil companies. Do I think we need drugs? Hell yeah, I know we need drugs. I don't want them writing rules for what we pay for their drugs. I don't want the oil companies writing rules about what kind of energy we're going to allow to be produced or how much they're going to pay their employees. I don't want it. That's the job of the government. That's what democracy's for. We need to take back the democracy so those laws represent us, not them. That's the fight.
Position on the carbon tax?
So listen, California has had really progressive energy laws, including a cap and trade system since 2006. So we've had 13 years of being able to see what drives change, what drives clean energy, what's effective. I can tell you this, the thing that has driven change is regulation. It's building codes, it's renewable portfolio standards, it's EV regulations and miles per gallon rules. The thing that's good about a carbon tax or a cap and trade is it raises money, which you can then, we've directed it disproportionately to low-income communities to basically compensate them for the pollution that they've undergone. But it leads to what ends up happening with a carbon tax and with cap and trade, if it's your driving force, it leads to some unintended consequences, and people hate it. So in fact, what we've seen is really, my plan leaves open the idea of some sort of price on carbon, and I have an opinion about the difference between carbon tax and cap and trade, but really what we need are some rules for how people are supposed to behave and drive that. Just say no.
May I have a question? Thank you. My name is Mario. My question is, what you said sounds great, or we already heard the same ideas from other candidates and also even from President Obama. But he couldn't do all what he promised because of the government, because of the corporations in Congress, in the Supreme Court, in the White House. How are you planning to dismantle all the power they have, and so they are managing the country basically?
So, obviously, Mario, that's a critical question. Because what I really am saying is, it's all about how do we get this done so that we can get the healthcare we want, so that we can get the education system we want, so that we can get a living wage. So it really is, I understand how critical this is. I think the first thing that has to happen is to name the problem. If we're going to make a change in society, we have to talk about it and accept that this is the change we're trying to make and get a mandate from the people to do it. I mean, the last 10 years of my life have been about organizing people at the grassroots. And if you think, look, I started Need to Impeach 2 years ago. I was naming a problem. We have a crook as a president. People said there's no way that can ever change because nobody in Washington, D.C. wants to impeach him, which was true at the time. I am a big believer that if the people of the United States decide on something, we get it. And so one of the things, I never heard President Obama make this argument. I never heard him go out after, I mean, I have not heard someone say either of the two things I'm saying. The number one problem we have is corporations have bought the government. We need to take away their power. And that's what I'm running on, that statement. And no one else who's running is saying, I will declare a state of emergency on climate on day one and make it my number one priority because we have to. And so to me, I believe in the power of the American people. If we decide something, we're going to get it because these people can't stand up to us if we've really decided. If that's the number one priority and we decide on it and they go against us, they know they'll lose their job. So they're not being nice. They're trying to figure out how to hang on to their job. And so to me, we have to name it. I have to get a mandate from the people to do it. And then I have to go out and do it. And for people who stand in the way, we have to run over them. I mean it. This is not a kumbaya moment. For voters in the United States, I believe what I'm saying is good for Republican voters. I do not disrespect or disregard them or not care about them. I really don't. But for elected officials who sell out the American people, I'm very angry. You know, I always say to people, if you tell the truth and put the American people first, I don't care if we disagree on everything, we can be very friendly in it. That's democracy. I don't think I'm right about everything. But if you don't tell the truth and you put the American people someplace but first, I have a big problem. And that's my feeling about this. We need to, this will happen if the American people decide. That's true on impeachment, you guys. This man will be impeached and thrown out of office if we all watch TV and go, he's a crook, he has to go. If you don't vote for that, I'll never vote for you. The Republicans can't withstand that. We need to name this because it's so wrong what's going on in the United States with these corporations. I mean, the idea, literally, that people wouldn't have a raise for 40 years, that is nuts. The idea that we would, I mean, seriously, we've come to accept it. But climate change, the idea that we care more about the profits of oil and gas companies than the health and safety of Christian, are you kidding me? That's nuts. We should not be accepting that. And my whole point in this campaign is, I don't want people to accept that, and I want to, this is about the American people insisting on it, not on me. And for people who fight us, I feel exactly the same way, tough. We're just going to have to roll over them.
That sounds good.
Thank you. You have another question?
Hello, my name is Beverly Harry. I work with Planet Action, and I live within the indigenous sustainable community. We are able to fish. We are able to eat the fish, and we are able to harvest pine nuts from the mountains and bring those pine nuts back to our families. Our humility is braided within, the protection that we seek for the lands, for the water, and for the wildlife, for all of our brothers and sisters. And our brothers and sisters are not of the human race. These are the plants that are protecting us. Those are the plants that provide us shelter, and all of the food that we obtain from them. And so right now, if you look at what is happening in Barrow, Alaska, at ground zero, there is climate urgency.
I know.
And that climate urgency is real. And so my question is, and has to provide, my question is that what would you do to protect the life that we think needs to be protected? How are you going to enforce the laws, the present laws, to make sure that everything around us is protected? Because those laws are there.
So,
And what would you do to bring an understanding to what survival is and what needs to be done to begin healing the earth?
so thank you for that question. I do know that climate change is just one aspect of what's going on this planet as a result of the activities of human beings. I have read a book detailing this from a scientific standpoint, not a spiritual standpoint, what's going on in terms of extinction around the globe, called the sixth extinction, that this will be the sixth time in the history of the planet where we're risking losing the majority of species that live here. I don't know if you know this, but I've been part of the regenerative agriculture movement, trying to show how to raise animals in a way that takes care of the soil, that uses water in a thoughtful way, and also sequesters carbon, resequesters carbon into the soil. So everything that you're saying about the idea that we are part of nature and it needs to sustain us and we need to sustain it as part of a larger environmental system, I agree with. So what am I actually talking about? I was sitting here while you were talking about what that actually means in terms of policy right off the bat. The public lands of the United States, I'd stop oil and gas drilling on. I would understand that those are the public lands for the use of the American people and that they're not for the exploitation of people to make as much profit as possible. I do believe that we're going to end up raising animals and raising crops in a much more regenerative way that is easier on the earth. I know that if you look at the composition of the soil, we've been leaching all the positive nutrients in the soil out since Europeans showed up here. If you look at the carbon density of soil in the United States, it's gone from somewhere around 10% to somewhere around 1%. I know that actually resequestering carbon in the soil is something that we can do that is much better for the land and also will help our climate problem. but I know that our climate problem is what seems to me the most urgent, timely aspect of a larger question about preserving the earth. And I understand, or at least I think I heard from you, that you look at that not just in a sort of analytical and scientific way, but in a more holistic way, in terms of the meaning of life and what we're doing here and how to think about ourselves as part of the planet and as part of relationship with the earth and the other animals that are living on this earth and the plants. And I take your point that if we have an exploitative attitude towards the earth, which is what we've had, we will end up in a place where that earth, in effect, can no longer sustain us. And if we do that, you're making a larger case for it, but in the simplest measure, we will end up in a place where what we depend on is no longer there to be depended upon. And so, trust me, when I talk about climate, it's not an unemotional thing. That's your point. That's my point.
Hi, Janet Serial. I'm the chair of the Black Caucus for Washoe County Dems. My question goes back to some comments you made earlier about dark money. My biggest concern right now with this election is there's a lot of talk about change, but no one wants to address the primary problem is, you know, how are we going to change the political lobbying? You talked about dark money, and how are we going to change those systems? Because a lot of what you're proposing requires that you change how we allow lobbying and dark money to exist in our political structure.
So let's start with the dark money question. I mean, dark money refers to money which is now given through independent expenditures in ways that are not disclosable. And we need to rewrite those laws because the first step towards fair elections is transparency. And the second step is extreme penalties for people who break that transparency. And I know in California, we've had propositions where with transparency, a company will spend literally $25 million and lose to activists who have less than $500,000. Because whenever it says who is paying for the ad, people think, okay, I know that's not true. Because it isn't, and it isn't true. So the first step on dark money, before we even have to change, there is a Federal Election Commission. They have a right to set rules about how money is spent in elections. They have a right to set penalties for people who break those rules. It's completely moribund. In 2018, the total amount of fines that they levied was $600,000. You know, you're in elections that cost billions of dollars. We're in elections where the winners get a $1.2 trillion tax cut. So $600,000, excuse me? How could that possibly impact? So that's the first place to go for transparency on dark money. We're going to have to change. When I said corporations aren't people, the drug companies aren't people, that is the hook that lets them participate politically in terms of campaigns. Because if you look at those campaigns, money is speech, according to the Supreme Court. Speech cannot be limited. Corporations are people, therefore their money is speech, therefore their money is unlimited in campaigns. That's why I said we have to get rid of that idea. They're not people. So therefore they should not have the rights of American citizens politically. That's my point. And I'll tell you a story about this, which is about the second point that you brought up, which was lobbying. So I was pushing an idea before I started this campaign about transparency for student borrowers in California. It was really student borrowers' Bill of Rights. Almost every other borrower has this, except student borrowers. And we were saying, if you call them on the phone as a loan servicer, you have to tell the truth. You have to tell them their choices fairly from their point of view. And we wanted to have a place where you could call in the state of California to get objective facts if you were a student borrower. That seems like a minimal thing. I was only talking to Democratic electeds because no Republican would ever talk to me anyway. And two things arose. One was, one of the state senators said to me, you should know that the banks and servicers, the lobbyists, have been in my office every single day for 2 weeks. This is a Democrat. And another Democrat said to me, do you really care about this? And I said, well, I mean, obviously I'm here because I care about it, but think about it. Student borrowers, young people who are trying to make themselves better citizens and more productive human beings, doing exactly what we ask every single young person to do. Do I care about them? Of course I care about them. The question is, how could you ask me that question? You're a Democrat. You're asking me, do I care about young people getting ahead in the world and having a reasonable chance? Of course I do. So I tell that story because when you talk about lobbying, these are Democrats. These banks are giving money to everybody.
Let me preface corporate lobbying. I meant to use that corporate before lobbying because there's a lot of.
But I mean, look, and my point is, if they're not giving tons of money, they can go and give their point of view and everybody knows it's just their point of view. The thing that's wrong is when they're giving tons of money, then when you show up, the question is, are you responding to the argument or are you responding to the money? And so I actually see this differently from the way that Senator Sanders sees this, because he sees this as millionaires and billionaires. I really see this as corporate. When I go and talk to elected officials, millionaires and billionaires are not walking the halls of Congress. Corporate lobbyists are walking the halls of Congress. They do it as a job. They don't do it, once every 4 years when there's something up. They do it every day. They do fundraisers all the time. It's their job. This didn't just happen. When I was talking about the defense contractors, I think that was earlier, but I'm just saying, it didn't just happen one day. It's every day for years. It's relentless. It's a job. It's a program.
Go, and then we'll get you in the back. My name is Ethan Clift, and I'm actually a corporate lobbyist. And so I actually went down to legislature in 2017, right after Trump was elected. And my number one fear was that my wife and I are both transgender. And my fear was that other people like us would be discriminated against because I knew that he was not socially aware enough to make sure that our country did not get divided along those lines. When I got there, I ended up working on some great legislation, social legislation, but I also picked up a couple of corporate clients towards the end. And that was the way that I justified that is that I was able to then
Do the other work
I wanted to do, right? Because I was getting paid a wage, so a livable wage for me. And so I was I tried to stay as clean morally as I could possibly stay. I mean, I only took on clients that I believed in. But at every turn, you're still compromising. And it's a constant game of compromise. And what you just described earlier is exactly the process. I mean, as a lobbyist, my job was basically to go to fundraisers to create strategies for the companies that are represented on giving strategies. You need to give to this person, you need to give to this person, you need to give to this person and this person, because if either of them wins, if this guy loses and this guy wins, he's gonna look and see that you didn't give to him, even though you don't like him as a candidate. It's a very logical profession, and so one of the unintended consequences of an issue like term limits, for example, is that, say in the state of Nevada, we have citizen legislators. They're only there every 2 years for four to 6 months or so, right? So what ends up happening is that the lobbyists run the asylum.
They know
run
more.
It. They know more, yeah. And so once you get term limits, now you've got new legislators who are trying to climb the ladder. They have ambitions, political ambitions, and now you have lobbyists that know more than they do and who are wiser about the process, and they become sort of their mentors, right? But they also require something in return. So that entire system, and it's in every state legislature. It's obviously in D.C. At even a heightened level. I mean, here, for example, you might have a race that only costs $250,000 to run, right? Which is totally different than a congressional race. Think about how much, if I just strategically want to take Tom's money and put it somewhere for these 3 causes, I could tell you right now exactly where I would put it, and I could tell you that there's probably an 80% chance that I would get you an ROI on that. Like, that is how precise lobbying is as a science.
Yeah.
A social science, mind you. So I just, to me, the dark money, there's so many ways to get around these laws, and even term limits, like, it's done the exact opposite in Nevada, which is that now these, things that people have been working on for decades, now they can no longer work on, and now you have a new legislator who's clueless and overwhelmed because they're generalists at best, and they have, 1,200 bills to go through in 4 months that they need to at least know a modicum about, right? So I'm not really satisfied with your answer, I guess, about
term limits
dark money
specifically?
and term limits. Yeah.
Well, the dark money question, I think, is clear. Is that, transparency is the first statement, and then the second statement is about getting rid of the idea that that they have a right to be, the right of every human being in America to have unlimited free speech, which is considered political giving. Those are, I think, straightforward things. I know that the point you're making about term limits is a good one, and there's always a trade-off between that point and the point about people who really get ensconced and become creatures of the establishment, and their career is completely safe because they're completely protected by corporate,
Can I just
partners.
add to that,
So it's always
diplomacy?
a trade. Like
Yeah.
there's no perfect system, and we all know that.
that's right.
And so I think what we found in California was exactly what you said. Term limits gave too much power to lobbyists, so they lengthened the term limits and moved them around in a way to try and avoid that. And is it perfect? No. But is it better than where they started or the first place they went? Yes. And so I think it really is a trade-off between those two things. Sorry, I interrupted you, Ethan.
No,
So I don't want to interrupt, but we only have time for one more question. We only have a couple of minutes left, and I just want to get the gentleman in the back before we end.
And I'll be really short.
Do you have a mic, sir?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
I'll be really short. My name is Ed, excuse me. I agree essentially with everything you said, and I do agree too about the toxic political effect of corporate power and money in general. But there's a flip side of this, it seems to me, and I'm curious as to how you might address it. To me, one of the biggest and worst lies that conservatives and Republicans have promulgated for a long time, for decades at least, is that government can't do anything right. It's incompetent. It's inherently incompetent. And it's a swamp. It's just run by the elites. And obviously, I'm not going to apologize for all the horrible things that government at the federal, state, and local levels has done, for sure. But it is a huge lie. And it falls on fertile territory in the United States, where we have a very, very individualist tradition. So unlike in maybe a lot of other countries where it's kind of a rich elite that just sort of makes that argument and everybody else is powerless, here you actually have this big populist group of people who believe it too, and they are being disadvantaged. They are being screwed. So I just think this is one of the worst lies ever. The government cannot do any good, and therefore should not do any good. One of the effects of it is that even when Republicans have scandals, it kind of plays to their advantage. It just proves, once again, that government can't do anything good. So that's my question. How would you deal with that?
So I agree with what you're saying, Ed. I really see this a little bit the same way that I see the conversation that I was having with Don about reparations and retelling the American story. Because I think that Ronald Reagan was very effective in saying, and he did, he said, the scariest words in the English language are I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And everyone laughed, and it really made a difference. And he made this accompanying argument that the free market is effective, efficient, and just. And that's not true. In an awful lot of what we're seeing, we're not seeing traditional free markets the way we learned about them in Econ 101. And so if you see the market for insulin, it's not a free market. If you see the market for defense electronics, it's not a free market. You know, so many of our markets are so concentrated either in terms of very few sellers or very few buyers. So that this whole idea that government's inefficient, but corporations are efficient. Corporations are efficient at getting their bottom line. But in a monopoly situation, in Econ 101, it's supposed to be you produce the best product at the lowest price so you win. In a monopoly situation, if you're the only seller, you produce the worst product at the highest price because they need the product and you can charge whatever you want. So I think it's really important as we talk about this. Look, I'm a private sector person. I know we need the private sector. I don't want to get away from it. I want it to be used in a way that serves the people of the United States. And I want to come back to what Ethan said, which was, you know, look, there's nothing wrong with lobbying. There's nothing wrong with making your points. Businesses have good points to make. They just shouldn't be buying the answer. And so if they want to hire Ethan because she is the best person to make that point, great. But I don't want them to be able to have it absolutely work because they made a bunch of campaign contributions or independent expenditures so that they know for a fact the answer is going to be what we ask it to be.
But how do you avoid that if I mean, these politicians need money to run campaigns. They have to fly places, right? Like you need to fly places. You're
Public
independently
financing,
wealthy. How
public
would you solve that?
financing of campaigns. The best way, you know, the thing that I've seen that I thought made a lot of sense is where every contribution up to $200 gets matched. And the number of people use, and there's no magic in this multiple, is 6 times. So if someone gives you $100, the government gives you $600. And so there's no way for everybody counts, but nobody counts too much. And so it's a way of saying, I know these campaigns. Well, if nobody had so much money, maybe they wouldn't cost so much. But what I am saying is we need to get, you know, I think we need to retell the story of what works in America. And the idea that government, name me the country that works with no government. I mean, human beings went through this world with very little government for a long time, and it was very bad. You know, I think in the United States, we don't realize how great it is to live under a rule of law. A lot of the world doesn't really live under a rule of law. You know, it's corrupt, it's unfair, people control it. And when you look at those countries, and you know, as an investor, I've traveled around the world and looked to see what happens in those countries. It's not good. Corruption is unbelievably expensive. Government is absolutely essential. I mean, the Republican Party is complaining about public schools. It's like, can we remember back before there were public schools? Like, do we want to go there? There's some people there who don't like public roads. Do we really want to go there? I mean, look, we need a government. We've tried to take everything away from this government. There has been this campaign started by Ronald Reagan with these stories that aren't true, that we have to fight back against and flip on their heads and start talking about in the 21st century. Look, that's my whole thing, 21st century. What is the actual vision for America? My point is the actual vision for America should be we have the rights to health care. We have the rights to education. We have the rights to clean air and clean water. We have the right to a living wage. We have a right to a fair political system. Those are our rights. The government is going to ensure those rights. Now we can argue about how best to do it, but those are our rights, and we're going to insist on them, and we're not going to allow corporations to run this country for themselves.
Thank you so much, candidate Steyer. You're all the time.
Thank you, guys.
I want to thank you for coming in to learn about it today and having this discussion with us and answering some of our questions and being just real and having discussion with us. Thank you.
This is totally my treat. You guys should know. This is honestly, Sunday afternoon, this is what I like to do. This is the most important thing I can ever do. Honest to goodness.
Thank you all so much for joining us.
Hey, Ethan, I want to make sure.